One of the things that we often talk about in the context of health and safety, and more particularly in the context of accidents, is what causes an accident. Ironically, however, most health and safety legislation is not actually concerned with the causes of accidents. Health and safety legislation creates legal obligations that we have to discharge, and if we're not discharging those obligations, then we're committing an offence, or at least potentially committing an offence, regardless of whether our conduct causes or doesn't cause an accident. In fact, people can be prosecuted under health and safety legislation even where an accident doesn't occur. This is a concept that we talk about as liability coming before causation. You can be liable for an accident even though you didn't cause it. An example of this is the Fuller decision. Matthew Fuller was a building site supervisor on a construction site. As part of the work being undertaken, they were doing tilt-up panel construction when the panels collapsed and there were 2 fatalities. Now, Mr. Fuller, as the building site supervisor, wasn't even on site on the day of the fatality. He certainly wasn't involved with the work, he wasn't giving any directions in relation to that work, and in fact, he had nothing to do with the work that was being done at the time when the accident occurred. Mr. Fuller was on site the next day showing some government inspectors around the scene of the accident, and they were there to investigate the accident under health and safety legislation. While they were undertaking the inspection, they came across a largely unrelated hazard. What they found was a small concrete panel that was leaning up against a larger one. This was identified as a hazard. Mr. Fuller, as the building site supervisor, he had obligations to identify hazards, report them, and to do something about them. He had conversations with the inspectors, and it became apparent that he hadn't done anything about this hazard even though he was aware of it. By not reacting and doing something about the hazard, Mr. Fuller was breaching his obligations under safety legislation. He was committing an offence. Mr. Fuller's offence had nothing to do with the fatality. It had nothing to do with the accident the previous day. But that didn't matter. Notwithstanding that Mr. Fuller's breach of the legislation didn't have anything to do with the accident, he was prosecuted, he was convicted, he was fined $2,000 and ordered to pay over $1,500 in legal costs. A key point to come out of the Fuller decision is that people can be prosecuted for breaches of safety legislation even though that breach doesn't contribute to or cause an accident.